Dr. Richard Nielsen lived an interesting and varied life. Among his many accomplishments is the research he did into the Kensington runestone. Dick and his work on the KRS was the focus of a documentary film project, and this is a collection of excerpts from that project.
My cooperation with Dick Nielsen started in 2002. We were at the conference at Thousand Oaks in California together, and there was a session there on the Kensington runestone. And I had not heard of Dick Nielsen before, and he made a presentation, and he presented the Kensington runestone as a medieval artifact, and I had studied the language, and I said that I could not accept his findings. So we were on the opposite sides of the fence. But we kept on communicating, exchanging information, and I was very soon impressed, first of all, by the guy's honesty and very much by his energy, because he has the single-mindedness of sitting down and just going through incredible amounts of material that even me and my colleagues, professional colleagues, we just can't stand doing because it's just too much work. And he culled information from that material. He read texts from the late 14th century, and he would come up with, say, 100 examples of what he thought were parallel usage with the Kensington runestone. As an expert, I could say that, 90 or even 99% of those examples just didn't pan out. They weren't true parallels. But there would always be something. He would come up with these nuggets of information that would prove that my earlier colleagues, they had claimed that this was impossible. And I think that Richard Nielsen has proved that it is indeed possible. Again, I would repeat, improbable, but possible. And there isn't almost a single word in the Kensington runic inscription which could not conceivably have existed in the Middle Ages.
All my grandparents immigrated from Denmark. On my mother's side to Tyler, Minnesota, where after 2 years they took a homestead in Montana. On my father's side, he immigrated first by himself to Racine, Wisconsin, and then later married my grandmother, who was much younger but from the same village, and they took a farm in Iowa, about 60 miles south of Albert Lea in Minnesota. And in 1920, he sold that farm for $5,000 cash, completely clear. In 1920, a farm worker would work an entire year for $100. So he was rich because of World War I, when the grain prices were phenomenal, because they weren't growing anything in Europe, and they shipped the grain from this country there, and all the farmers did well. He retired to California, to a Danish community called Solvang, which means sun meadow, in the San Ynez Valley, about 20 miles from Santa Barbara. And my father was 12 years old at that time, and had been born in Racine, but he grew up in California, and he moved to Los Angeles. Now my mother grew up in Dagmar, Montana. It was a town founded by the Danes. It was called Dronning Damas Minibu, which is Queen Dagmar's memorial city, quickly abbreviated to Dagmar. But the Danish word is so beautiful because it's Dalma. It means the dawn, the girl of the dawn. She went to normal school a while in Tyler, Minnesota. And then she took a job when she's maybe 19 in St. Paul, Minnesota. She worked for 2 years as a cook for a doctor. And she walked down and bought the vegetables in that vegetable sales place, which still exists as a park today. So I often think of my mother. Now, she moved, her brother had gone to mechanic school in Fargo, her older brother and her only brother, and he had a car, and he said, let's go to L.A. I got a friend there. So she said, okay, I'll go with you. Well, she walked into the Danish Lutheran church and met my father, where in those days that's what most people did. They went to some place that would meet somebody from their country or their countrymen, and all the girls warned my mother that Richard was a rake, my father. He dances with all the girls. But they got married 6 months later, and this was in 1927. No, 1929. She arrived the day the market fell, the stock market fell, which I think is the 29th of October, 1929. That's when she arrived in L.A. I was born in 1933 after my older sister, Helga, who was born in 1930. And then I have a younger sister born in 1936. But we lived in Venice and then other places, North Hollywood and Fullerton. My father had a dairy, which he lost during the Depression. He always had a job, though, as a dairyman, usually among other Danes. My father was very good at marketing, so he had set up new dairies for sales. And so we ended up in Oildale, which is Bakersfield, California. And then later he got arranged to go to another dairy in Tulare, which is about 60 miles north. So I grew up in the San Joaquin Valley in my days of memory, and I went 10 years to that school in Tulare. And when I was in the fourth grade, I read Homer Holand's book on the Kensington Runestone. I went to my mother and said, I wish you'd teach me Danish because I want to study the Kensington Runestone. And she said, Richard, Denmark is such a little country, and Danish is so unimportant, why don't you just take Spanish? Of course, we learned a lot of Danish because all the food at the table was the Danish term. My mother was a Danish cook, and she knew all the terms. So in that sense, I did get some Danish in my vocabulary. Now, between my sophomore and junior year, we moved to Santa Cruz, California, which is on Monterey Bay, out of the dusty Tulare in the San Joaquin Valley. I graduated from Santa Cruz High School in 1951, and I was a valedictorian. No, I wasn't. I was a salutatorian. I was the second in the class. Gave a talk about how important education would be in the future. Korean War had broken out a year before I graduated, so I took all the examinations for the military academies, though I had been accepted to Stanford and Berkeley. I was a good student. I ended up accepting an appointment to the Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut, where I graduated in 1955. This opened another kind of opportunity to me because people didn't travel that much. I went across country by bus, and I loved geography. And the first thing we did was, at the end of my first year, we took a cruise to Europe. And where did we go? We sailed to Oslo, Norway, Copenhagen, Denmark, and Santa Cruz de Tenerife in the Canary Islands. So here Scandinavia opened up to me. And I had relatives in Denmark, and I was able to visit them, though I didn't know very much Danish, but I started to be very interested in it. And later on, Santa Cruz de Tenerife is important to our story because I wrote Heyerdahl in Santa Cruz de Tenerife, where he was retired, about the Kensington Runestone. And he put in motion, through his contacts in Sweden, to get the stone to come to Stockholm. I graduated from the Coast Guard Academy in 1955, and we made a second trip to Europe between my third and fourth year there, where we went back to Copenhagen and Holland and to Spain again. So, it opened my eyes about Scandinavia. And of course, in sailing there, we were close off the coast of Greenland, close off the coast of Iceland, close off the coast of Faroe Islands, the Shetland Islands, and so I could see and I navigated all these areas. We had to do that. So I took my sun sights and my star sights and navigated across the North Atlantic. So, it opened my eyes about the Viking era and Scandinavian era. I graduated in 1955, and I took an assignment on an icebreaker in Juneau, Alaska, and I spent 3 years in Alaska. I was on a ship called the Store Is, which was a Danish word, by the way, for strong ice. I was 3 years there, but on the third year, we made a circumnavigation of North America a very rare thing for a sailor. We left Seattle, went across the ice all the way to Greenland, and then all the way down through the Panama Canal and back up. So talk about seeing the world and doing rare things. That happened to me. After 3 years in Alaska, I got another overseas assignment. Normally that doesn't happen. But I said, I just want to go someplace warm, and I got to Hawaii. So I was in Hawaii and lived there, and we went to Japan and back from Hawaii. And my first daughter was born in Hawaii. After I had 4 years at sea, sent me to the University of Michigan to be a naval architect and marine engineer. And I had a BS from the Coast Guard Academy in marine engineering, so I became a naval architect from Michigan. But I also took an MA in mathematics at Michigan. And I prospered at Michigan. Wonderful university. And one thing led to the other, and I got a fellowship to go to Copenhagen for a doctor's degree. And the Coast Guard sent me over there, and I got a Doctor Tech in Copenhagen. It's a Doctor of Technology, which is a higher level than a PhD, actually. I had done all my coursework at Michigan for a PhD, but I ended up going to Denmark. And I took that in ship structures, and because of that, I was assigned directly to Coast Guard headquarters to design the new class of icebreakers, and they're called the Polar class. And these ships are now just being retired after 30 years, but they've been going to Antarctica and in the Arctic. But they used my doctor's degree to design the structure, and so that was one of the reasons the icebreakers have had no structural problems in the last 30 years. That was my Coast Guard career, but I left the Coast Guard thinking I was going to make my fame and fortune in engineering, not realizing that I wasn't prepared for the civilian world. I mean, the Coast Guard is like a monastery. I mean, you're just dealing with people who tell the truth, you think. But going out in the civilian life was very difficult for me for a while. But anyway, I decided to go overseas and work in the oil and gas business in London. And I spent 5 or 6 years in London. Big projects in India and Thailand out of there, down in Nigeria. So I have ended up in the oil business the last 30 years in over 140 countries. My technical life has been varied and interesting. My partner and I today are involved in selling oil fields. We get the right to have rights in oil fields, and we sell them to people who want to make investments. So that's what I'm doing now. And it's just perfect for me at my age because it allows me to work on what I want to work on, when I want to work it. And I spend most of my time on the Kensington Runestone, frankly, at this age. I'm 77. So I learned Danish in Denmark when I was taking my doctor's degree. And I learned the King's English, and I was so anxious to talk to my mother when I talked to her, but she had a dialect from Jutland, and I couldn't understand her, and she couldn't understand me. My children would say that, Far, du har en frygtelig dansk. You have a terrible Danish. I'm not good on the accent. My son speaks it perfectly. Actually, 3 of my children speak Danish perfectly. They grew up in Denmark, and so I'm glad for that. And I work a lot with my youngest son, who's very good at it. Tay is his name. He even has a Danish name. Well, I knew about the Kensington Runestone from the 4th grade, and when I decided to go back to the United States, I said I need to have a project so I can keep my Danish. And I decided to pick the Kensington Runestone because it interested me, but I knew if I started studying that, I'd be reading Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish often, and I would develop and maintain my fluency in those languages. And that's what happened. And within 2 weeks of returning or starting up my studies in '85, I discovered the 10 on the Kensington Runestone was Arabic, or could be Arabic. And I was flying to Norway from San Francisco. I was working for Bechtel. And I visited the libraries in Norway and discovered that they knew about Arab numbers already by 1325, and they were known in Iceland already by 1250. So the fact that the Arab numbers were known was fine. And suddenly I had an Arab 10 on the Kensington runestone that I saw. This was within 2 weeks of starting my investigation. And but I also picked the Kensington runestone because I knew that my skill in mathematics and my knowledge of Scandinavian and the history of Scandinavian and my knowledge I had picked up in visiting all the runic museums in Scandinavia, and I lived there for 7 years, that this would be interesting for me. I had no idea that I would end up with this adventure, where I would go from discovery to discovery to discovery. It's kind of hard to get rid of that adrenaline every time you make a discovery.
Well, you know, the Kensington runestone's been around since 1898. Lots of researchers have worked on it. Why was there so much left to discover?
Because they didn't look at the data that was available or not available. Now, in Sweden, they started the Old Swedish Dictionary in 1884, and it wasn't finished until 1918. There was a preliminary one in about 1875, and they decided they needed a better one. So the real Old Swedish Dictionary came out during that period. So a lot of the words were not even known when the Kensington runestone was discovered, because around 1300, Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish would be about the same language. And you began to get a deviation about that time. It's been said that by 1350, that all the things that you find in modern Danish were already developed in Denmark. Why did they find the language so strange when the Kensington runestone was discovered?
The answer to that question lies in these books. Known as the Diplomatarium, these are the so-called diplomas. But most importantly, they are examples of the language in use at the time. They are not poetic, they are pragmatic, much like the inscription on the stone. Dick read through thousands of these diplomas, searching for examples of language that would match the inscription on the stone.
There's about 20 words that they said were modern and didn't exist in 1362. There was about 6 or 7 words that had the so-called wrong grammar that didn't exist in 1362. 80% of these words are just in this one volume. I mentioned that they translated the diplomas up until 1350, but at that time they also did the diplomas from 1401 to 1420. They wanted to see, because they thought that that's when what we call the younger Old Swedish started, and the Kensington runestone was in the elder Old Swedish, and there was quite a bit of difference between those two languages. And the assumption was that these diplomas that would have pertained to 1362 wouldn't have told anybody anything. How very wrong they were. The assumption was they weren't important. It turns out that they were the most important evidence for the development of the Old Swedish language there ever was. What the early investigators in 1911, where they mainly started talking about the Kensington runestone, would say, well, Swedish is an old, well-known language, and it's in this dictionary, and these words do not exist in the Old Swedish Dictionary. First of all, it was a framed argument. It was not a well-known language. And then they completed the supplemental dictionary between 1925 and 1975, where in that dictionary is a very important word for the Kensington runestone. It has Risa with an I, actually plural, riser. And it's not found in modern Swedish, but it was found in the Old Swedish Dictionary supplements. I found that. Couldn't believe my eyes when I saw it, because those were 2 words in the Kensington runestone that were supposed to prove that it was a forgery, because it didn't even exist in Swedish. The claim was it was a misspelling of the English rise. And as Henrik Williams says, I'm the first one to study these, and I struck gold. And what does this guy out of Tulare, California, who picked grapes and cotton and everything else when I was a kid, ending up with discovering something so important for the Old Swedish language? But that's what happened. People have asked me, am I a true believer? I was just asked by the Runestone Museum, by Jim Adams, in a letter to me saying, based on what you're writing, you do not seem to be a true believer. I wrote him back. I don't know if I said I'm not a true believer. I said, what I have said always, that I have not found any unambiguous evidence that is modern. And I haven't found any unambiguous evidence that it's medieval. We're still investigating the stone. I'm interested in the true evidence of the Kensington Runestone.
Dick worked at his own pace, and usually in solitude, but he was not alone in his efforts. He had some key collaborators and many supporters. When the stone was stained by another researcher, Dick developed a working relationship with the eminent geologist Dr. Paul Weiblin. This resulted in a new tool for investigation being brought into play: laser-scanned 3D imagery.
The most positive result from all of that was that eventually the modern technology of being able to image archaeological artifacts in 3 dimensions occurred. But probably that would never have been done if we hadn't had this circuitous route through this incident that we're talking about.
And just the tenacity of him going through all this information is impressive, and I think he deserves every credit for it. And he wants to find the true reasons. I still think that he holds the inscription to be medieval, but he wants it to be medieval because it is medieval, and not because you fake evidence to make it medieval. I think that it's not the question of who says something. The question is it the truth or isn't it? And even though he's an amateur in this field, he has a doctor of technology, he's a smart person, but here's an amateur. But an amateur means a lover of something, and he has loved this topic for decades by now. And it's by virtue of him alone that it's been revived. It was dead for a long time, and by his renewed efforts to put it into the debate that I think it has been revived as a possible candidate for medieval origin. And my respect was given to him because he had this honest search for the truth, and he wasn't afraid of a little bit of work there. And even though he's not a linguist and he's not a runologist, and these things are very complicated. There are very few of us who can do this. But he comes up with these suggestions, and we talk about them. And if I can present evidence why his examples are not correct, he will accept that. And he's forced me to accept some examples. I said, no, that can't possibly be true. And he said, well, what about this example? And I said, well, yeah, I have to admit that is a correct example. So I had to say, yes, it's possible this work could occur, for example. And by this back and forth, and with a person with an open mind and who doesn't give in easily, he's stubborn like a goat. I'm stubborn like a goat myself, and this is a very constructive clash. Whether the Kensington Runestone is 14th century or not is not trivial. It is central to questions of American history, American identity, American truth. We're not playing with stuff here. We're talking about the truth. That is the most important commodity there is in human life.
In 2015, Henrik Williams and Dick met at the Runestone Museum to examine the KRS. It's worth noting that in the entire history of the stone, this examination of the stone was done with the most highly qualified researchers ever. No other research effort brought as much linguistic, historical, and technical prowess to the task of examining the inscription as did Drs. Williams and Nielsen.
We're here to investigate the stone, actually for the first time with qualified runologists from Sweden, and it's really very exciting. We checked several runes that have been in discussion between Henrik and me on email. Many of the findings from 3D imaging that was done by Lorraine Jensen and myself has very much to do with this today, because a number of things have shown up in 3D imaging, which we needed to check with ourselves. And Henrik has agreed with a number of these findings today. As far as I'm concerned, the day couldn't have been any better. It has established a few things that could be only medieval. It's a good day. It gets back to the requirement that all evidence has to be unambiguous.
While Dick's research does not prove the inscription's authorship, it was important to him to achieve his goal of revealing and dismissing some of the faulty research made by previous language experts. While not a professionally trained linguist or runologist, his work advanced knowledge of the history of the Swedish language, and it does provide future KRS researchers solid ground to stand on for further study, or what Dick referred to as unambiguous evidence. And as Dick would like to say, not bad for a kid from the farm country of Tulare, California.